The signal came in at 3:17 Fleet Time, and by 3:19, the coalition had already started writing her eulogy. Caleb Mordaunt heard it on a salvage relay 2 systems out, leaning against a coolant pipe with a tin cup of bad coffee going cold in his fist. The relay crackled once, twice, and then the voice of some clerk on the SAR's Reach command barge said the words in the bored cadence of a man reading a grocery list. Princess Vale Arsoon of the Ilum, commanding the joint defensive line at the SAR gate, lost with all hands aboard the flagship Listening Stone. No recoverable wreckage. No survivors. Coalition flags to half-mast across the 7 inhabited worlds. End transmission. Caleb did not move for a long time. The coffee finished going cold. The coolant pipe ticked behind his ear like a slow clock. He had met Vale exactly 4 times. Once at a debriefing on Tarsus where she had towered over the table, with all 4 of her joints stacked in a kind of patient geometry, listening to a human admiral lie about troop counts. Once in a corridor where she had stopped and asked him, without preamble, why human soldiers carried photographs of their dead instead of speaking their names aloud. Once at a field hospital where she had sat beside a dying private from Iowa and held his hand in her 3-fingered grip and waited, just waited, until he was done. And once, 6 weeks ago, in a briefing room aboard the Listening Stone, where she had looked at him across a hollow table full of Vale fleet projections and said, in the low chiming voice the Ilum used for difficult truths, that if the line broke at SAR, she did not intend to be carried home in a box. She intended to walk. She had said walk. He remembered that, not survive, not retreat, walk. And now a clerk on a command barge was saying she was lost with all hands, and there was no recoverable wreckage. And Caleb Mordaunt, who had been a reconnaissance officer once and a neuropsychologist once, and was now neither, set the tin cup down very carefully on the coolant pipe and did not break it. He went to find a ship. The salvage station hung in low orbit over a moon nobody had bothered to name. It was the kind of place where the air smelled of old hydraulic fluid and burnt sugar, and where the men who ran the docks asked very few questions if you came with enough credit chits and the right kind of silence. Caleb had both. He had been saving the credit chits for a small house on a planet he had never seen. He spent them on a courier skiff with a half-functional jump drive and a hull patched in 3 colors, and a name nobody had bothered to repaint over. The dockmaster gave him the keys and asked where he was going. Caleb did not answer. The dockmaster nodded as if that was answer enough and went back to his ledger. He was already 3 jumps out when the Ilum envoy found him. She came aboard through the airlock without permission, which was the Ilum way of saying she was either very rude or very desperate. Her name was Shorel, and she was small for her kind, barely 2.5 meters, with the silver-gray skin of the southern continents and the long throat bands of a diplomatic caste. She stood in the cramped galley of the courier skiff and bowed once, the full bow, 4 joints folding into themselves like a closing telescope. "Reconnaissance Officer Mordaunt," she said, "you are going to recover her." It was not a question. He poured her tea. The Ilum did not drink tea, but they accepted it as a gesture, the same way humans accepted the bitter resin cups the Ilum offered at funerals. She held the cup in both hands and did not raise it to her mouth. "Why," he said, "do you think that?" "Because you are not weeping," she said, "and you have stolen a ship." He had no answer for that, so he sat down across from her and waited. She set the tea aside. From a fold in her robe she produced a small object, no larger than a child's marble, that pulsed faintly blue. Caleb knew what it was before she spoke. Every Ilum of royal blood carried a bond locator, keyed at birth to a corresponding stone held by their clan mother. When the wearer died, the stone went dark. It was one of the oldest customs the Ilum had, older than the empire, older than the alphabet they used to write the empire's name. The marble pulsed, slowly, faintly, but it pulsed. "Her mother holds the matched stone on Ilum show," Shorel said. "It has not gone dark. The coalition says she is dead. The wreckage scans say she is dead. The Veil propaganda channels say she is dead and laugh about it. But this stone says she is not dead. She is in a thin place. She is in the place between the lines on the map. Caleb looked at the marble. He thought of Vale in the field hospital, holding the dying private's hand. He thought of the word walk. The SAR reaches interdicted, he said. Coalition picket line and a Vale perimeter and about 8,000 kilometers of wreckage that nobody's cataloged. And the thin places out there, I read the reports. Last salvage crew that went in came back without faces, literally without faces. Their helmets were full of teeth. Yes, Shorel said. I'm one man with a half-broken skiff. Yes. Admiral Hessar declared her dead an hour after the battle ended. He has reasons for her to stay that way. He'll send people. Yes. Caleb looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the marble. Then he picked up his cold tea and drained it. I'll need a thief, he said. Shorel inclined her head, which was the Ilum equivalent of a smile. There is one waiting for you at Corm Drift, she said. He has been told you are coming. He has been told you are very stupid and very stubborn. He has agreed to help for reasons of his own. What reasons? He did not say. He said you would not ask. Caleb almost laughed. It came up out of him like something rusted finally turning, and he caught it before it could become anything bigger. He stood. He set the cup in the recycler. He looked at the small blue marble pulsing in the envoy's three-fingered hand and felt, for the first time since the clerk's voice came through the relay, something inside his chest that was not grief and not anger and not duty, but was something older than any of them. Tell her mother, he said, to keep watching the stone. Shorel folded her 4 joints into the bow again, deeper this time. Bring her back, stranger, she said. It was the first time anyone had ever called him that, and it would not be the last. Corm Drift was a scrapyard the size of a small moon, made entirely of the bones of ships that had died in 3 previous wars and never quite finished decomposing. It rotated slowly through a thin nebula the color of bruised plums, and the men and women who lived inside it had names like Tin and Spar and Hollow, and answered to no flag. Caleb brought the skiff in low, threading the access lanes between hulks that had once been dreadnoughts, and docked at a service ring where someone had spray-painted a crude, 4-jointed figure giving the universe an obscene gesture. The thief was waiting for him in a galley that smelled of fried protein and old gun oil. His name was Roe, and he was a small, wiry man with a face like a knife and a left hand that was 3/4 prosthetic, the kind of cheap chrome work that meant he had lost it somewhere they didn't ask questions about insurance. He wore a vac suit liner under a salvager's coat, and he was eating noodles out of a cup with a pair of chopsticks made from what looked like rifle cleaning rods. He did not stand when Caleb came in. He did not stop eating. He looked up, chewed, swallowed, and said, around the noodles, "You're the idiot." "I'm the idiot," Caleb agreed. "The Ilum envoy said you'd be taller." "The Ilum think everyone should be taller." Roe snorted. He set down the cup. He looked Caleb up and down with the slow, appraising gaze of a man who had spent most of his life calculating the resale value of things, including people. "All right," he said, "sit down. I want to know 3 things before I get on a ship with you. First, why? Second, why me? Third, what's the cut?" Caleb sat. He told him. He told him about the 4 meetings with Vale. He told him about the marble in the envoy's hand, and the stone on Ilum show still pulsing. He told him about Admiral Hessar, who had wanted the SAR gate to fall so he could claim the coalition needed a unified command structure with him at the top of it, and who had declared Vale dead an hour after the battle ended, because as long as she was officially dead his political math worked. He told him about the thin places out past the wreckage line, where the Vale perception weapons had torn holes in something that was not space and not time, but that the Ilum called the Undernet and the human neuropsychologists, in their quieter papers, called the substrate. He told him that he, Caleb Morden, had spent 4 years before the war studying that substrate at a university nobody remembered anymore, under a man named Donal who had believed, and convinced him to believe. That perception was an interface, and the world behind the interface was so much larger and stranger than the surface that a man who could learn to see past it could walk through walls. He told him that Donal had died screaming when the veil came, and that he had carried the work in his head ever since, and that this was the first time he had ever found a use for it that did not feel like betrayal. He told him there was no cut, there was no payment, there was nothing on the other side of this except a princess, alive or dead, and a long walk home. When he was done, Rose sat for a while with his chopsticks in his hand, and his noodles getting cold. "You're not selling this very well," Rose said. "I'm not selling it." "Yeah, I noticed." Rose scratched the side of his nose with the chrome hand. "All right, I'm in." Just like that. Just like that. Rose stood, picked up his cup, drained it. "My sister was on the listening stone, junior environmental tech, 23 years old. She wrote me a letter the week before the battle and said her commander was the best officer she had ever served under, that the princess walked the decks every night and learned the name of every rating on board, and that if anything happened, my sister wanted me to know she had not been afraid. The coalition death notice came through 3 days ago. I burned it. I don't believe in death notices written by clerks. If the princess is alive, my sister might be alive. If they're both dead, I'd like to know where. Either way, I'm going. The cut is information. That's the cut." Caleb nodded. He did not say he was sorry. There was a thing the Ilum did not do that humans often did, which was to apologize for griefs they had not caused, and Caleb had decided a long time ago that the Ilum were right about that one. "When do we leave?" Rose said. "Now." "Good, I hate corn drift. The noodles are terrible." They left within the hour. The SAR reach on the long-range charts looked like a smear. Up close it looked like a graveyard that someone had set on fire and then forgotten to put out. The battle had been 3 weeks earlier, and the wreckage was still slowly tumbling, still slowly venting, still occasionally igniting where a leaking reactor found a leaking fuel line and decided to have one last conversation. Caleb brought the skiff in along a slow ballistic arc, engines cold, riding the edge of a debris field thick enough to confuse the picket sensors. Rose sat in the co-pilot's chair with his prosthetic hand resting on the navigation board, and his real hand resting on a sidearm that he had not bothered to declare. "That's a coalition picket," Rose said, nodding at a long-tailed cutter drifting 200 kilometers off their port. "I see it. They'll have a kill order with your face on it by now." "Probably. You don't seem worried." "I'm worried. I'm just busy." Rose smiled, thin and quick, and went back to watching the sensors. The plan, such as it was, depended on the substrate. The veil perception weapons used at SAR had not merely scrambled sensors and dazzled gunners. They had torn the local substrate thin, the way a thumb tears wet paper. In places, the membrane between the surface world and what lay behind it had given way entirely. Coalition science teams had charted some of these openings before being ordered by Admiral Hessar's office to stop charting them. Caleb had a copy of the last unredacted map, given to him by a friend of Donal's who had also believed and who had also been quietly fired. The map showed the listening stone's last known position. Around it, in a rough sphere about 200 kilometers wide, the substrate was, in the polite language of the report, anomalous. In the impolite language of the salvage crews, it was haunted. They went in through a hole in the coalition picket that Roe found by watching a patrol skiffs running lights for 40 minutes and counting the gaps in its sweep. Caleb killed the main drives and they coasted, riding momentum, while Roe whispered numbers to himself and adjusted attitude with the maneuvering thrusters in tiny apologetic puffs. They passed under the cutter's belly so close that Caleb could see the rivet pattern on its hull. Nobody hailed them. Nobody fired. The cutter slid past and away and was gone, and they were in. The wreckage thickened around them. Spars of what had been a cruiser drifted past on the port side, the cruiser's name still legible on a section of buckled plating, conscious of the long road. A Vale Lance frigate lay split in half ahead, both halves slowly spinning in opposite directions like the two halves of a cracked egg. There were bodies. Caleb did not count them. Roe did not count them either. There was a particular silence that fell in a debris field where the dead outnumbered the living several thousand to one, and they sat inside it and let it sit on them, and they did not speak. When they were close enough to see the listening stone, the substrate began to bend. It happened first in the corner of Caleb's eye. A piece of debris that he had been tracking on the starboard scope was suddenly somewhere else, and then somewhere else again, without ever appearing to move. The cockpit lights took on a color that did not have a name. Roe made a small sound, like a man biting down on a piece of bone hidden in soft bread. "That's the edge," Caleb said. "From here we go slow." "Slow," Roe said. "Right, slow." He looked at his chrome hand. He flexed the fingers. He looked at his real hand. He flexed those fingers too, as if checking that both sets still belonged to him. "I'm going to ask you a question, and I would like you to answer it honestly." "Ask." "Are we still in the ship?" Caleb looked around the cockpit. The instrument panel was where it had always been. The view screen was where it had always been. His own hands were on the controls where his hands belonged. The cup of cold coffee he had brought from Corm Drift sat in its holder. Outside, the substrate bent. "We are still in the ship," he said. "Anchor on something small, a texture, a smell. The way the chair feels against your back. Don't anchor on the big things, they'll slip first. Small things hold." Roe nodded slowly. He pressed the chrome hand flat against the panel and stared at the place where the chrome met the metal. Caleb hummed, very softly, a tune his mother had hummed to him when he was small and frightened, a lullaby with no words that came from a country that did not exist anymore. He hummed it without thinking, and Roe did not comment. But after a moment, Roe's shoulders came down half an inch and stayed there. They went in slow. The first trap was waiting for them about a kilometer from the listening stone's broken spine. It was not a Vale trap. It was a coalition trap. It had Hessar's signature all over it. A small autonomous drone, painted matte black, hanging in the substrate like a spider in the corner of a ceiling. It did not fire weapons. It did not need to. It broadcast on a band that was not exactly a radio band, on a frequency that was not exactly a frequency, and what it broadcast was an instruction. The instruction said, "You are not here. You did not come. Turn around and go home and forget you ever heard the name Vale Arsoon." Caleb felt the instruction hit his frontal lobe like a wet sponge thrown at the inside of a window. He saw Roe's face go slack. Roe's hand drifted toward the navigation controls, toward the recall jump, toward the keys that would send the skiff lurching backwards out of the bent substrate and back into the safe geometry of ordinary war. "Roe," Caleb said. Roe did not answer. His pupils were the size of pinholes. "Roe, listen to my voice. The hand, the chrome hand. Tell me which finger is missing the second joint." Roe blinked. His hand stopped moving toward the controls. He looked down at the prosthetic, frowning, as if it were a thing he had never seen before. Slowly, his real hand reached over and touched the chrome thumb, the chrome index, the chrome middle. He stopped at the middle. The middle had a stutter where the second joint did not quite line up with the third, the kind of cheap manufacturing flaw that anybody who had worn the thing for a year would know without looking. "Middle," he said. "Middle, good, that's real, that happened to you, hold on to that." Roe nodded. The pupils came back up to normal. The slack went out of his face. He looked at the navigation controls, looked at where his hand had been about to go, and pulled the hand back into his lap and held it there with the other hand, hard, the way a man holds a dog that has tried to bite. "That was not a nice thing," Roe said quietly. "No." How many more of those are there going to be? As many as Hessar could afford. He's a wealthy man. Right, Rose said, right. Okay, small things. I am anchoring on the middle finger of my chrome hand. That is my anchor. I would like to register a complaint with the management. Noted. How did you not feel it? The instruction. I felt it crawl into my head. Caleb looked at the panel. He did not answer for a moment. I felt it, he said. I have practice. Donald taught me. He used to make us sit in a room with a recording that said over and over in a very kind voice that we should leave the room. Some students lasted 10 minutes. The longest I ever did was 4 hours. Donald said the trick was not to fight the instruction. The trick was to notice that the instruction was a separate thing from yourself, and then to set it on a shelf, and then to keep doing what you were doing. A shelf. A mental shelf. Your dead professor taught you to put alien mind control on a shelf. He taught me to put any mind control on a shelf. The aliens didn't invent it. They just refined it. Rose stared at him for a long moment. I am going to need you to teach me about the shelf, he said. I will, Caleb said, later when we have time. They went in further. The second trap was not a trap so much as an environment. The substrate around the listening stone had thinned to the point where the wreckage itself was not entirely committed to existing. Pieces of the flagship phased in and out of solidity. A bulkhead that had been there a moment ago was a suggestion of a bulkhead now, a watercolor sketch of a bulkhead, and then it was solid again, and ringing with the impact of a piece of debris that had drifted through where it had not been. Caleb maneuvered the skiff carefully through the slow ballet of half-existing wreckage, and the substrate hummed in his teeth, and somewhere very far away and very close he heard, or thought he heard, the sound of someone singing. The singing was in Ilim. He did not speak much Ilim. He knew the high formal phrases for greeting and farewell, and the few words a soldier needs to know in the language of an ally. He did not know the song, but he knew the voice. Row, he said, cut engines, drift, listen. Row cut the engines, they drifted. The hum of the skiff died down to nothing, and into the nothing came the song, very faint, very far, the four-toned harmonics of a single Ilim voice singing something that sounded like a lullaby and a battle hymn folded into the same melody. Row closed his eyes. That's her, isn't it? He said. I think so. Where is it coming from? Caleb looked at the wreckage of the listening stone, spread across 100 kilometers of bent space. He looked at the bond locator Marble Showrel had pressed into his palm before he left, pulsing now in time with the song. He looked at his own hands on the controls. Everywhere, he said, and one place. He pointed. Deep inside the broken spine of the flagship, where the substrate was thinnest and the wreckage was least committed to being real, there was a single point of light. It was the color of a memory of blue. The marble in his palm pulsed toward it like a compass needle toward true north. That's a thin place, Rose said. That's the thin place. And she's in it. She's in it. Roe took a breath. He flexed the chrome hand. He flexed the real hand. Then let's go get the princess, he said. They could not fly into the thin place. The skiff would not survive it. Caleb suited up in the vac rig he had stolen from a coalition supply station 2 systems back, and Rose suited up in a salvager's rig that had been patched so many times it looked like a quilt, and they tethered themselves together with 30 meters of monoline, because Caleb had read enough of Donald's papers to know that in a thin place the worst thing that could happen to a man was being alone. They left the skiff drifting in a stable pocket, and they crossed the last kilometer on suit thrusters, threading the bent geometry of the listening stone's broken spine. The wreckage talked to them as they passed, not literally, but in the way that wreckage talks to anyone who has spent time in it. A strip of charred Ilim script on a bulkhead, a single boot drifting end over end, a hand-painted slogan on the inside of a gunner's blister that said, in a young rating's careful hand, the coalition phrase for hold the line. There were bodies. Most of them were Ilum. Some of them were human. The monoline between Caleb and Ro went taut and slack and taut again as they navigated around what was left. Halfway across, Ro said on the suit comm, "I am not going to look for her. My sister. I am not going to look for her face." "You don't have to," Caleb said. "I want to. I am telling you I want to, and that I am not going to." "Okay. If I see her, tell me I didn't see her." "You didn't see her." "Thank you." They went on. The entry to the thin place was a hatch that was not a hatch. It was an oval of light set into the side of the flagship's broken spine where no oval should have been, where the structural diagrams Caleb had memorized showed nothing but reinforced bulkhead. He stopped in front of it and put his gloved palm against it and felt nothing at all, which was wrong, because vac suit gloves were supposed to transmit at least some sense of pressure and texture, and this transmitted neither. His hand sank into the light up to the wrist. He pulled it back out. It came out whole and undamaged and not, as far as he could tell, changed. "You first," Ro said, with a forced cheerfulness that did not quite reach the edges of his voice. "You are the substrate guy. I am the chrome hand and the small anchor. After you." Caleb did not argue. He held the marble in his fist and he stepped through. The thin place was a corridor. It was the central corridor of the listening stone, and it was also not. The walls were Ilum alloy, and they were also bone, and they were also water, depending on how one looked at them. The lights overhead flickered in patterns that were not random and were not patterns. At the far end of the corridor, very small, very far, sat a figure. She was on the deck with her back against a bulkhead. One of her 4 arm joints was at the wrong angle. There was a long dark stain down the side of her uniform from a wound that had stopped bleeding, because there was no longer enough of the substrate present to support the concept of bleeding. Her bioluminescent throat bands, normally a soft silver blue, were the dim red of an Ilum in extremis. Her eyes were open. She was singing. Caleb walked toward her. The corridor lengthened and shortened as he walked. The walls reached for him and pulled back. The lights overhead became, briefly, a flock of small birds and then became lights again. He kept walking. He hummed his mother's lullaby, very quietly, under the singing of the princess, and the 2 melodies braided together without quite touching, and the corridor steadied. Ro stepped through behind him. Caleb heard the small sound of a man trying not to be sick. He did not turn around. He kept walking. When he reached her, he knelt. "Your Highness," he said in the formal Ilum greeting, the one he knew, "I have come to walk you home." Vale Arsoon stopped singing. Her eyes focused on him slowly, as if she were swimming up from very far down. For a long moment she did not seem to recognize him. Then something in her face shifted, the slight loosening of the lower jaw that was the Ilum equivalent of a smile, and she said, in the chiming voice he remembered from the briefing room 6 weeks ago, "Officer Mordant, you are late." "I came as soon as I heard, Your Highness." 6 weeks. 6 weeks I have been waiting." "It has been 3 weeks since the battle, Your Highness." She closed her eyes. 3 weeks here," she said. 6 weeks in the thin place. Time does not match. I have been counting. I counted by singing. I sang every song my clan mother taught me, and then I sang every song my nurse taught me, and then I sang every song my soldiers taught me, and then I started over. I knew someone would come. I did not know it would be you. I am glad it is you." "Your Highness, can you stand?" "No." "Can you be carried?" "Yes." He looked at her arm joint. He looked at the wound. He looked at the long 4-jointed frame of her, twice his size, that would have to be folded carefully and held carefully and walked carefully back through a corridor that was sometimes a corridor, and sometimes bone and sometimes water. "Ro," he said without turning around, "I need you." Ro came up beside him. Ro looked at the princess. Ro did the smallest, briefest bow Caleb had ever seen, more a tilt of the helmet than a bow, but it was a bow. "Your Highness," Ro said. You are the thief, Vale said. I am the thief, Your Highness. Good, we will need a thief. There is something in the next compartment that we must take with us. It belongs to my people, and the Vale wanted it, and they did not get it. I would prefer not to leave it for them to come back and try again. The lattice, Caleb said. She looked at him with something that was almost amusement. You know of it. I have read papers, old papers, Donal's papers. Donal, she said, the chiming voice softened. He was a friend of my mother's before the war. I am sorry for his death, Officer Mordaunt. He was a man who saw. Yes, Your Highness, he was. Then you know what the lattice does. I know what he thought it did. He was right. She told him, in the 4 sentences she had the breath for, what the lattice did. It was a device the Ilum had built 3 centuries earlier, and then mostly forgotten, because the Ilum were a careful people who did not use a tool merely because they had one. The lattice did not alter reality. It altered the interface between a mind and reality. A person holding the lattice could choose, within limits, what they perceived and what they did not. A fleet equipped with the lattice could choose not to perceive Vale perception weapons, and the weapons would slide past them like a hand sliding past a closed door. The Vale had wanted the lattice for the same reason in reverse. A fleet armed with it could choose not to perceive coalition defenses, and the defenses would slide past them in the same way. The princess had carried the lattice into the Battle of Sar's Reach because the Ilum High Council had voted, narrowly, to deploy it. She had been carrying it when the flagship broke. She had pulled it into the thin place with her, where the Vale could not follow, and she had waited. It is in the next compartment, she said. In the captain's locker. The captain is dead. I closed his eyes. The locker is keyed to my voice print. I will open it. You will carry it. You will carry me. We will go home, Officer Mordaunt. We will walk. Yes, Your Highness. And one more thing. Yes. There is a child. Caleb went very still. Your Highness. A human child, from the engineering deck. She was 12. She was the daughter of one of my crew. She survived the breach because she was in the substrate shielded section by accident, looking for a kitten she had brought aboard against regulations. When I came through the thin place, I found her. I have been singing to her also. She is in the next compartment. The kitten is dead. The child is not. Her name is Myra. She is asleep. She will need to be carried too. Caleb closed his eyes for a moment. He thought about the size of his skiff. He thought about the math of the long burn home with a wounded princess and a sleeping child, and a thief with a sister he was not going to look for, and a stolen artifact that could rewrite the war. He thought about Hessar's drones in the substrate behind them, and the kill order with his face on it, and the picket cutters and the Vale perimeter beyond. He opened his eyes. We'll need more rope, he said. Ro almost laughed. The sound was thin and shaky, but it was a laugh, and in the bent corridor of a flagship that was also bone and water and birds, it sounded like the realest thing in 3 light years. I have rope, Ro said. The compartment was small and dark and smelled, very faintly, of cinnamon. The Ilum used cinnamon-equivalent compounds in their air filtration the way humans used pine. Vale Arsoon spoke a single low phrase in Ilum, foretoned, and the captain's locker clicked open. Inside, on a folded blue cloth, sat the lattice. It did not look like anything. It looked like a piece of bent metal about the size of a man's open hand, with a single seam running through it that did not quite close. Caleb had expected it to be more impressive. He had also expected it to be less impressive. Both expectations turned out to be wrong in different directions and at different distances, and looking at it made his eyes ache. He folded the cloth around it. He put it in the chest pouch of his vac rig and sealed the seal. The child was in the corner of the compartment, asleep on a folded uniform jacket that had been the captain's. She was small for 12, or perhaps the Ilum's sense of human ages was off. She had brown skin and a soft black halo of hair, and a smear of engine grease on her cheek that had been there for 3 weeks because there had been no water to wash it off, and she had not, in any case, been entirely real for most of those weeks. She had a snub-nosed face and a bandage on her left hand, and her chest rose and fell in the slow rhythm of substrate sleep, which was not quite sleep and not quite stasis, but something the Ilum had a word for, and humans did not. Ro knelt by her. Ro did not touch her. Ro just looked at her for a long moment. "My sister was 23, he said. "I know. This is not my sister. I know. I am still going to carry her. I know." Caleb knelt by Vale Arsoon. The princess put her good arm around his shoulders. She was very light. He had expected her to be heavy because she was tall, but the thin place had been eating her, and she was very light, and that was a thing he was going to have to feed in the days ahead and not think too hard about now. Ro gathered up the child Myra in his arms, careful of her bandaged hand. The kitten, somewhere in the compartment, was past helping. Ro did not look for it. Caleb did not ask. They walked back down the corridor that was sometimes bone and sometimes water. Caleb hummed his mother's lullaby, and the princess, on his shoulder, hummed with him in four-toned harmonics that should not have fit a human melody, and did, somehow, fit, the way two languages sometimes find the same word for the same small private thing. Myra slept in Ro's arms and did not wake. The walls of the corridor steadied as they passed. By the time they reached the hatch that was not a hatch, the lights overhead were only lights, and the bone was only metal, and the substrate briefly remembered how to be substrate. They stepped through into the wreckage. The skiff was where they had left it. The picket cutter was not. In its place, 200 kilometers off and closing, was a coalition enforcement frigate with Admiral Hessar's personal insignia on its prow. "Of course," Ro said. "Of course," Caleb agreed. They got aboard the skiff. Caleb laid the princess in the bunk in the back compartment, the only bunk, and folded the thin blanket over her. He laid Myra beside her. Myra did not wake, but her small hand found Vale's three-fingered hand in her sleep and curled into it, and Vale looked down at the curled hand, and her throat band shifted, just slightly, from the dim red of Extremis to a deeper, steadier rose that Caleb had not seen on an Ilum before but understood, somehow, immediately. He went to the cockpit. He sat down. Ro was already in the co-pilot's chair. "How long until they're in firing range?" Ro said. 4 minutes. "How long until we can jump?" "The drive is half-functional, 8 minutes, maybe 10. "That math does not work." "No." Ro looked at him sideways. "You have an idea." "I have an idea." "Is it a good idea?" "It is the only idea." "Tell me the idea." Caleb opened the chest pouch. He took out the lattice in its blue cloth. He set it on the navigation board between them. The single seam in the bent metal caught the cockpit light and did not quite reflect it. "The lattice doesn't change reality," he said. "It changes the interface. We don't have to outrun Hessar's frigate. We have to choose not to perceive it. And we have to make it not perceive us, for 10 minutes, long enough for the drive to spin up. You can use this thing." "I can use this thing." "How do you know?" "Donal's papers." "Your dead professor." "My dead professor." Ro stared at the lattice. He stared at Caleb. He looked back over his shoulder at the bunk where the princess and the child lay curled together. He looked at his chrome hand. He flexed the middle finger with its stuttering joint. "All right," he said, "use the thing." Caleb picked up the lattice. It was warm in his hand, which surprised him, and he understood after a second that the warmth was not heat. It was something else, something his nervous system had decided to translate as warmth because it had no other category to put it in. He held it flat between his palms. He closed his eyes. He thought of Donal at a chalkboard in a basement room at a university nobody remembered, drawing diagrams of nested perception loops with a piece of chalk worn down to a stub. He thought we are not here. He thought they are not there. He thought small things, small anchors, the chair against my back, the cold coffee in the holder, the hum of the drive spinning up, the chrome hand of the man beside me with the stuttering joint in the middle finger, the four-toned breath of the princess in the back compartment, the small curled fingers of a child named Myra asleep in her hand. These are real. These are the only things that are real. Everything else, the frigate behind us, the kill order with my face on it, the perimeter ahead, is interface, is paint on glass, is a story someone told themselves about how the universe was supposed to go. We are not in their story. They are not in ours. The lattice grew warmer. The seam that did not quite close opened, just barely, and through the opening Caleb felt the shape of the substrate behind the world, the great breathing thing Donal had taught him to feel for, and he set his hand against it and pushed. In the back compartment the princess began, very softly, to sing. On the long-range scope, the coalition frigate slowed, stopped. The targeting array swept across the space where the skiff was and did not register the skiff. The communications array pinged a query at the wreckage field and got no response because the skiff was not, as far as the communications array could tell, generating a response surface for the query to bounce off of. The frigate held position. The frigate began slowly to drift in a wide search pattern around a center that was not the skiff's actual location. "Holy hell," Ro whispered. "Don't say anything, don't move much. Anchors, hold the anchors. The interface is not strong. I am not strong. Donal was stronger, and even he could only do this for an hour at most. We have 10 minutes. 10 minutes. 10 minutes. Ro did not say anything else. He pressed his chrome thumb against the stuttering middle finger of the chrome hand. He pressed his real hand flat against the navigation board. He breathed slowly. In the back compartment the princess sang. The sleeping child did not wake, but her small fingers tightened, very slightly, around the princess's three-fingered hand. The drive spun up. The minutes passed. The frigate searched. Caleb held the lattice and held the interface and held himself, and Donal's voice in his head from a basement room 12 years gone said, gently, almost amused, "The trick is not to fight it. The trick is to notice it is a separate thing from yourself, and then to set it on a shelf, and then to keep doing what you were doing." At 9 minutes and 40 seconds, the drive light went green. "Jump," Caleb said. Ro jumped. The skiff folded itself into a single point and unfolded somewhere else, and the Sar Reach and the frigate and the wreckage and the thin place were all behind them, all very far behind them, and they were in open, clean, empty space with a princess and a child and a lattice and a long way still to go. Caleb set the lattice down on the navigation board. His hands were shaking. He had not noticed they had started. "Where are we?" Ro said. "Somewhere quiet for now. Hessar will find us again." "Yes. He has more ships than we have miracles." "Probably." Ro looked at him. Ro looked at the lattice. Ro looked back over his shoulder at the bunk. "Then we'd better keep moving," Ro said. They kept moving. The journey home took 9 days, and it was 9 days that Caleb Mordaunt would remember in pieces for the rest of his life, the way a man remembers a long illness, in moments rather than continuities. The cinnamon smell that came off Vale's uniform when he finally got her out of it and cleaned the wound on her side and braced the broken arm joint with 2 pieces of a ration bar wrapper and a length of hydraulic line, because that was what they had. The small voice of Myra asking on the second day where her mother was, and the long silence that followed because the truthful answer was on the engineering deck of a ship that was no longer a ship, and the answer Caleb gave instead, which was that her mother had asked him to take care of her until they got home, which was not a lie even though it was not, in the literal sense, a true thing either. The way Ro taught Myra to play a card game with a deck he had stolen from somewhere, the cards worn soft at the edges. Rowe explaining the rules with the patient, slow voice of a man who had not spoken to a child in a very long time and was rediscovering the shape of the language. The way Vale ate on the third day, for the first time, a small bowl of Ilum ration paste that Rowe had also stolen from somewhere, and the way she looked at the spoon afterwards and said, in her chiming voice, that human food utensils were ridiculous and elegant in equal measure, and she would like to know who had decided spoons should be that shape. The way on the fifth day HFY found them. It was a different ship this time. A small, fast hunter-killer, painted in the slate gray of HFY's private fleet, with no markings and no insignia, and a single forward gun that could punch through the skiff's hull from 300 kilometers out. It came in fast, and it came in quiet, and the only reason Caleb saw it at all was because Rowe had insisted, every 6 hours, on a full passive sweep, and the sweep caught the hunter-killer's drive emissions for a fraction of a second before the hunter-killer realized it had been seen and cut its drive. Caleb did the math in his head. The math was not good. Lattice, Rowe said. Lattice won't work twice, not on a dedicated hunter-killer. Their sensors are tuned for substrate anomalies. They'll see the not seeing. Then what? Then we fight. Rowe stared at him. We fight, Rowe said. We fight a hunter-killer in a half-broken skiff, with a hand cannon I stole from a bar and a sidearm and the princess of an alien empire who cannot stand up. Yes. All right, Rowe said. I am noting for the record that I think you are insane, and I am following you anyway. I want this recorded. 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 Caleb went to the back compartment. Vale Arsoon was awake. She had been awake more often as the days passed, the substrate damage knitting itself slowly back into ordinary tissue, the thin place pallor leaving her bioluminescent bands one shade at a time. She was sitting up against the bulkhead, with Myra asleep against her uninjured side. She looked at Caleb and she knew. How long, she said. 12 minutes. What do you have? A sidearm, a hand cannon, the lattice, 3 of us. 4, she said. Your Highness, you can't. I can hold the lattice. You can barely. I can hold the lattice, Officer Mordaunt. I am Ilum. I have held heavier things than this, and I have held them longer. Bring it to me. He brought it to her. She took it in her 3-fingered hand, and she closed her eyes, and she sang very softly, and the lattice in her hand did something it had not done in his hand. The seam that did not quite close opened a little further and a little easier, and the warmth that he had felt became, in her grip, a kind of low resonant chord, and he understood suddenly that he had been using a flute as a hammer, and she was now using it as a flute. Go, she said. Fight, I will do my part. The hunter-killer will be confused. I cannot hide us entirely. I can hide where we are not. What does that mean? It means, she said, opening her eyes, that when their gun fires, they will fire at where you are not. Trust me, go. He went. The gunfight that followed lasted 4 minutes by the cockpit clock, and longer than that by the clock in Caleb Mordaunt's chest. The hunter-killer fired 3 times, and 3 times the shots passed through space that the skiff had been in a half-second earlier and was not in now, because Vale Arsoon in the back compartment had chosen, with the lattice, to be elsewhere. Caleb flew the skiff like a man riding a bad horse through a thunderstorm, hard banks and ugly cuts, the hull groaning in places it should not have groaned. Rowe worked the secondary gun, which was a thing the skiff had not been designed to have, and which Rowe had welded onto the hull at Corm Drift out of parts he had stolen from a salvager who had stolen them from somewhere else. And Rowe was a better gunner than he had any right to be. And on the second pass, he put a round directly into the hunter-killer's forward sensor cluster and blinded it. The hunter-killer kept firing anyway, blind, hoping, the gun cycling on whatever last known coordinates its targeting computer could extrapolate. The shots went wide. The shots went wider. Caleb came around for one more pass, low and close, and Roe leaned out of the side hatch with the hand cannon he had stolen from a bar and shot the hunter-killer's drive ignition coil, point blank, with a single round, and the hunter-killer's engine assembly went up in a slow blossom of orange that filled the cockpit window and faded. The hunter-killer drifted, dead, in the empty space behind them. Caleb set the skiff back on course. His hands were shaking again. He did not bother to hide it this time. Roe came back into the cockpit. Roe was bleeding from a long shallow cut on his forehead where something had come loose during one of the hard banks. Roe sat down in the co-pilot's chair and held the hand cannon in his lap and looked at it for a long time. "Looks like you've got a tentacle problem," Roe said, finally, without looking up. It was an old joke. It was a joke from before the war, from a comic strip that had run in the Coalition Forces newsletter, where a hapless private was constantly being attacked by tentacled aliens, and the captain would arrive in the last panel and say, in a deadpan voice, "Looks like you've got a tentacle problem." Caleb had not heard the line in 8 years. He had not expected to hear it now. It came out of him sideways and ugly. The laugh he had almost let out on the courier skiff 6 weeks ago. The laugh he had caught and held down. And he let it out now, and Rose started laughing too. And they sat in the cockpit of a half-broken skiff with a dead hunter-killer drifting behind them and a princess and a child asleep in the back compartment. And they laughed until they had to stop because they were going to wake the child. In the back compartment, Vale Arsoon set down the lattice on the bunk beside her and closed her eyes and slept for the first time in 3 weeks. They made the Ilum border on the 9th day. It was Shorel who met them. She had been waiting at the border station for 9 days, the way an Ilum of the diplomatic caste waited, which was without complaint and without sleep, and with a small pot of resin tea kept perpetually warm on a low burner. She came aboard through the airlock, and she went directly to the back compartment, and she knelt by the bunk, and she put her 3-fingered hand against the side of Vale Arsoon's face, very gently, and she said something in Ilum, low and foretoned, and Vale opened her eyes and said something back in the same tone, and Shorel folded all 4 of her joints down to the deck and pressed her forehead against the back of the princess's hand and did not move for a long time. Caleb went out into the corridor. He gave them their moment. Roe was already there, leaning against the bulkhead, the chrome hand flexing slowly. "Hessar," Roe said. "Hessar is going to be a problem. He has the political math. He had the political math when she was dead. She is not dead. The math is different now. He won't go quietly. He doesn't have to. The Ilum High Council does not need him to go quietly. They need him to be visibly wrong. We are about to make him visibly wrong." Roe looked at him. "And then what? And then there's a war to win. And then what, Mordant, after the war?" Caleb was quiet for a long time. He thought about the small house on a planet he had never seen, that he had been saving credit chits for, the chits he had spent on the skiff. He thought about Donal in a basement room. He thought about his mother humming a lullaby that came from a country that did not exist anymore. He thought about a child named Myra who would need a place to grow up, and a princess who had asked, on the 7th day, in her chiming voice, what human children were taught in school about the substrate, because she thought perhaps the coalition curriculum should be revised. "I don't know," he said. "I don't know what's after." "Good," Roe said. "I would not have believed you if you'd said you did." They went back to the cockpit. They brought the skiff in to the Ilum border station, slow and careful, with a princess in the back compartment who was no longer in extremis, and a child who was beginning to ask questions about where they were going, and a lattice wrapped in a folded blue cloth that was about to become, in the next 24 hours, the single most contested object in 3 star systems. When they docked, the Ilum Honor Guard was waiting on the platform. They were in full ceremonial array, 400 of them, the silver gray of the southern continents and the deep bronze of the northern, their throat bands lit in the soft rose of recognition. The clan mother of the Arsoon line stood at the front, very old, very small, holding in her three-fingered hand a stone the color of a memory of blue, which was pulsing. Caleb carried Vale Arsoon down the ramp of the skiff. She had asked to be carried, not because she could not have walked the last few meters, but because she said, quietly, that she wanted her mother to see her come home in the arms of a human, because that was the truth of how she had come home, and the truth was the thing her mother deserved to see first. He carried her down. Ro followed, with Myra in his arms. Myra was awake now and looking around with the wide, solemn eyes of a child who has seen too much and has decided, sensibly, to keep her questions for later. The clan mother stepped forward. The honor guard knelt, 400 of them, the slow folding of four-jointed bodies all at once, like a wave going down a shore. The clan mother of the Arsoon line looked at her daughter in Caleb Morden's arms. She looked at Caleb. She looked at the small, pulsing stone in her own hand. She closed her 3 fingers around the stone, and the stone went dim because it was no longer needed. She said in Ilum, a phrase that Caleb did not know. Vale Arsoon translated it for him, in his ear in her chiming voice. She says, "Who is this stranger who has brought my daughter home alive?" Caleb knelt carefully so as not to jostle the princess. He set Vale gently on the platform, supported against the clan mother's small, steady frame. He stood. He looked at the clan mother. He thought of all the formal Ilum he had ever learned, all the high phrases for greeting and farewell, and none of them fit. So he said in plain coalition standard, the only language he had ever really spoken, "My name is Caleb Morden. I was a reconnaissance officer. I am a friend of your daughter's. I came as soon as I heard." The clan mother of the Arsoon line looked at him for a long moment. Then she folded all 4 of her joints into the full bow, the deepest bow the Ilum had, the one reserved for clan elders and battle mothers and the dead returning. The honor guard behind her bowed deeper still. "Then you are no stranger, Caleb Morden," the clan mother said, in careful coalition standard. "You are kin. Welcome home." Behind Caleb, on the ramp of the skiff, Rose stood holding a small human girl who had been 12 years asleep in a thin place, and who was now awake and looking at the 400 kneeling Ilum with an expression that was not fear and not awe but something quieter and more interesting than either. The lattice was in Caleb's chest pouch. Admiral Hessar was, somewhere 2 systems away, in the process of receiving the worst piece of news of his career. The war was not over. The war would not be over for a long time. But the stone in the clan mother's hand had gone dim because it was no longer needed, and the princess was breathing, and the child was awake, and the thief was bleeding only from a small cut on his forehead. And Caleb Morden, who had once been a reconnaissance officer and once been a neuropsychologist, and was now, apparently, kin to an Ilum clan mother, stood on the platform of a border station 2 systems from a war he had just changed the shape of, and he hummed, very quietly under his breath, a lullaby with no words that came from a country that did not exist anymore. His mother had taught it to him. He thought she would have liked, very much, to see how far it had carried. Later that night, in a guest chamber high in the cliff city of Ilum show, with the twin moons rising over a horizon the color of slow embers, Caleb sat by a low window and listened to the city breathing. The Ilum slept in shifts. Some quarter of the city was always awake, and the singing never quite stopped, low chorale work drifting up from the lower terraces in four-toned waves. Myra slept on a couch by the inner wall, a real blanket pulled up to her chin, the smear of engine grease finally washed from her cheek. Rose slept in the next room, snoring through the cut on his forehead, the chrome hand laid carefully on the bedside table as if it had earned its rest. Shorel came to the door without knocking the Ilum way. She brought tea. He drank it this time, so did she. The Ilum, it turned out, sometimes drank tea when they were tired enough. She explained it as a matter of solidarity rather than thirst, and he accepted that without comment. "Hessar," she said, has issued a statement. He claims credit for the rescue. He says he sent you. He says you were a deniable asset operating under his personal authority. Of course he does. The Ilum High Council has issued its own statement. It contains a quotation from the clan mother. What does the quotation say? Shorel almost smiled. It says, "We know who brought her home. We were there. We bowed." Caleb looked into his tea. The leaves at the bottom had arranged themselves in a small spiral that probably meant nothing. He chose to read it as a good sign anyway. Small anchors, small things. Hesar will fall, Shorel said. Not tonight, not next week, but he will fall and you will not have to lift a hand to do it. The lattice is back in the keeping of the High Council. The line at Sar will hold. There is much to do, but for tonight there is not. Tonight, Caleb said. Tonight, Shorel agreed, you sleep. She rose, she bowed the small everyday bow. At the door she paused. The princess asked me to tell you something, she said. What? She said, tell the stranger that he is welcome at any fire of the Arsoon line, for as long as the line exists. She said, tell him that I will teach him the song I sang in the thin place, because he hummed beneath it without knowing the words, and a song deserves to be known by the one who answered it. She said, tell him I am tired now, but tomorrow we will walk. Caleb set his tea down. He thought of a briefing room 6 weeks ago, and a four-jointed figure across a hollow table saying the word walk. He thought of the long corridor that was sometimes bone and sometimes water. He thought of a child named Myra sleeping under a real blanket. Tell her, he said, I will be ready. Shorel inclined her head and was gone. He sat by the window for a long time after. The twin moons cleared the horizon. The city sang. Somewhere on a planet he had never seen, the small house he had been saving for waited, and he understood in the slow way that important understandings arrive, that he was not going to need it. He was already home, in a way he had not been home in a very long time, and home was not a house but a small set of small things, a child asleep under a blanket, a thief snoring next door, a princess who would walk tomorrow, a song waiting to be learned. He hummed his mother's lullaby, very softly, one last time into the dark. Then he slept.